Welcome back to another VOR lecture. On today's lecture and today's video, what we're going to be discussing is roll type movements, the roll VOR, and what kind of eye movement do we create or do we make in order to compensate for head roll. So on this particular instance, this particular video, what we're going to discuss is a head roll to the right. So as we've talked about in class, a head roll to the right, from my perspective here, is going to stimulate the right anterior and the right posterior canal. The left side, the left anterior, left posterior canal is going to be inhibited by this head rotation. For ease of demonstrating these pathways, I'm just going to show you the excitatory pathways here. And I think in just a little bit, once you see how many pathways are going on, you'll understand why I decided just to stick with the excitatory pathway for this particular video. If you're interested in the inhibitory pathways, please send me an email, let me know in some way, and I can create one of those videos, no problem. So let's go ahead, let me share my screen, and we'll get started over here. So here is our diagram, simple diagram again of the brainstem structures and EOMs that are responsible for generating the VOR movements. So I sort of have the easiest way I found to create these pathways and to think about these pathways is first to know which canals are being stimulated. So step one, determine the canals that are being stimulated. And as I've already discussed, if we're going to talk about a roll or a head roll to the right anterior canal and the right posterior canal are going to be stimulated by this movement. The next thing that I want to do is figure out which EOMs are going to be innervated. So I know where I start, and now I want to know where I end, and then I can fill in the blanks between them. So on the right eye, if my head is rolling to the right, then the upper pole of my right eye has to end cyclotort. So I need to know which muscles are responsible for end cyclotorting my eye. And that's going to be the superior oblique mainly. That's its primary action. And then the superior rectus also has one of its actions is to end cyclotort the eye, end cyclotort the right eye. So on my left eye, if my chin or if my head is rotating to the right, so my right eye has to end cyclotort, my left eye has to ex-cyclotort. So on the left side, I need to know which muscles are my ex-cyclotorters. And so for the left eye, my inferior oblique and my inferior rectus are going to be my ex-cyclotorting muscles there. End cyclotorsion of the right eye and ex-cyclotortion of the left eye, while my head rotates to the right, is going to keep everything on the fovea as I need it to in order to have good vision. So we're going to, in fact, utilize both the anterior and the posterior vestibular pathways in order to make this happen. But we're going to start on the anterior excitatory pathways. Well, before we get there, let's talk about the nuclei that are going to be involved in stimulating these muscles. So if we're talking about the right side extensively, or specifically rather, we know that in fact both of these nuclei are going to be on the left side, because the superior rectus, as you know, its signal actually originates on the contralateral side. So it's going to originate here in this oculomotor nucleus, travel across the brainstem or just a very short distance to the contralateral superior rectus, and then exit that nuclei, contralateral oculomotor nucleus, sorry. It's going to travel across to the contralateral oculomotor nucleus, and then it's going to exit that nuclei via the oculomotor nerve, via cranial nerve 3, and go into the orbit. For the superior oblique here, it's going to require the left trochlear nucleus in order to make that happen. So in fact, for the right eye, both of the connections are going to be on the left side. And for the left eye, things are going to get a little bit more complicated, because the inferior oblique, it's just going to be a very short distance here. It's going to innervate its own inferior oblique, and it's going to innervate its own inferior rectus. But the complicated part is going to be, where do these signals come from? Because as we've already discussed, that's going to utilize both the anterior and the posterior canal's excitatory pathway. So let's get back into it. Let's talk about the anterior canal specifically and what connections it makes. So what you're going to notice here is that these connections are exactly the same as we looked at before whenever we have downward chin acceleration. So DAC, downward chin, downward head acceleration, is going to result in anterior canals being stimulated. But instead of it being both the left and the right anterior canal that are being stimulated, in this case, it's just the right anterior canal that's being stimulated, because we're in fact not pitching our head down, we're rolling it to the right. And so it's going to be the right anterior canal that's stimulated. So the right anterior canal, as part of its connections, it's going to synapse on the superior portion of the vestibular nucleus, just like you learned for downward head acceleration. No difference here. Those connections are exactly the same. The next step, so one neuron is going to synapse in the vestibular nucleus. The next neuron is going to, in fact, cross over via the brachium conjunctivum and then ascend until it meets, until it gets to the midbrain, and then it's going to synapse onto the cranial nerve 3 nuclei, specifically the nuclei for the inferior oblique and the superior rectus. Now, this is exactly the same thus far as what we learned for downward chin acceleration. So the inferior oblique is going to go on and synapse on its own ipsilateral inferior oblique, just like you learned before. Superior rectus, in fact, goes through the brainstem to synapse on the opposite side's oculomotor nucleus. But for ease of demonstration here, I'm just going to draw this line across, decusating across, and then coming up here and synapsing on the superior rectus. But again, don't let this confuse you. As I said before, everything that you've learned to this point still holds true. So these connections are, in fact, just within the brainstem, decusating and then using this oculomotor nerve to go to the superior rectus. So this is, in fact, the excitatory signal for the anterior canal, just like we learned it before. Now we need to fill in the blanks on the posterior canal. So the posterior canal is going to send its connections from its canal via the vestibular nerve again, and it's going to go to the vestibular nucleus. And then specifically, it's going to go to the medial vestibular nucleus. And I forgot to put this. This is the superior. We'll call this one the medial vestibular nucleus here. So this one is also going to decusate. This one's also going to decusate, and it's going to utilize the MLF, but for ease of drawing purposes, I think I'll try to keep it kind of on the outside here. But just know that it's utilizing the MLF here, and I'll kind of draw a red arrow from here to demonstrate this. So it's going to utilize the MLF, and it's going to have a couple of branches. The first branch is going to come off here and innervate the trochlear nucleus. Second branch is going to continue on up, and it's going to innervate the oculomotor nucleus. So remember, in order to make our eyes cyclotort as we need them to, and so for a right head tilt or a right head roll, rather, we need to do a levocyclotorsion. The upper poles of both eyes need to move to the patient's left. And so that's going to require the right eye to encyclotort and the left eye to excyclotort. So as part of that, the inferior rectus needs to fire for the left eye, and the superior oblique needs to fire for the right eye. So this is pretty simple, just like it's going to go, just like the other connections here. It's going to stay ipsilateral, and it's going to connect to its own inferior rectus. The trochlear nucleus, as you know, the neurons exit the brainstem dorsally, decusate, and then start to move anteriorly, wrapping around the brainstem, and then joining the other nerves as they enter the orbit. For ease of drawing, I'm going to show this kind of going behind. Imagine that this is going behind here and coming back out, and then it's going to connect up to this superior oblique. So maybe I should just connect these. I'll just connect these pathways here so you can kind of see. And then again, this doesn't utilize MLF or doesn't cross within the brainstem tissue itself, and in fact exits the brainstem and then wraps around it. So hopefully this doesn't confuse you here. But These are in fact the pathways for a right head roll. So if you're rolling your head to your right, you need to perform a levocycloversion to the left. Well, I guess that's redundant, but you need to perform a levocycloversion in order to compensate for that right head roll. Again, these are just the excitatory pathways. I felt like for ease of understanding, it would be best to start here. If you're interested in the inhibitory pathways, please let me know. Real quickly, I can show you just the pathways or just the muscles that would be innervated to result in inhibition according to Sherrington's law. So if our eye needs to in-cyclotort, then we need to effectively inhibit our ex-cyclotorters. And in the right eye, that would be our inferior rectus and inferior oblique. Over here, the left eye needs to ex-cyclotort. So we need to inhibit our in-cyclotorters, which would be our superior oblique and superior rectus here. All of those would come from this right anterior and posterior canal as well, just as before. And so you can go back and review the individual connections for those for the downward and upward chin rotation in order to determine where those connections are made. And again, if you are interested in a video on that, please let me know. But I felt like the excitatory pathways were enough in this instance. So again, this has been a right head roll and compensating VOR movement. Please let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.